Thank you so much, Steve, for being with me today on the WaveCapital's guest speaker series on relationship building in a team environment. You're my 82nd guest. How are you today?
I'm doing great. I'm honored to be on your podcast. Although I wish I was number one or number two and not number 82.
Oh, that's okay. 82 is a lucky number, I'm sure. And it's so wonderful to connect. I was watching the documentary American Prince, the story of JFK Jr. A dear friend of yours
Right.
goes back at your time at Brown University. And you're an historian. I mean, you've taught at Oxford, you have taught in a number of places, University of Oklahoma. You've been featured in a lot of publications. You've been interviewed on TV. You've written a lot of books. And just talking offline, you mentioned one of your books and you interviewed Keith Stein, who Keith Stein will also be on my podcast, a lawyer at Denton's in Toronto, who was a businessman at the time, who met JFK Jr. 4 days before he passed when JFK Jr. was looking for investors to promote his publication, George, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But just given your longstanding friendship and your friendship with JFK Jr. and his tragic passing, it's very important that we have this discussion for my audience and me to learn about your friendship with him, things that we might not have known about him, other than if you know him very closely. Because in the public eye, we only, especially for someone like me who grew up learning about the Kennedy family, how much they were revered, although controversy at times. They are America's fabled, if you will, or mythical in some contexts, but type of family that you would consider to be, what would rival the king and queen in England. So it is interesting to have this conversation with you, especially that the documentary came out on CNN, and also learning what relationship building has meant to you and what has it meant for your professional career. So let's have this very important conversation.
I think we individually have certain skills, but we always need other people to help you to achieve certain goals. So I'm a writer, but I need a really good editor and a whole production team to help turn my books into published books. I spent some 20 years at the History Channel and I hosted a show called History Center for about 10 years. And then I did a bunch of documentaries. And in each case, I can remember when we would do the my Sunday morning talk show, History Center. We would get together, producers, associate producers, and talk about how we're going to make this work. And everybody has a certain amount of expertise that they add to it, and together you create something that's better than it would have been if any just one person had tried to do it. So, as an historian, when I was doing the show, I had a lot of the knowledge, but the producers had a much better sense of how you communicate information, especially over television. One of my jobs was to try to recruit other historians who could do television. And as historians, we tend to, as professors, we're all professors, we tend to be long-winded. So the way you get yourself mixed as an historian who wants to do television is you ask a question and they respond, "Well, I have 5 points." Like, no, you don't. You've got about 30 seconds. So there's very few people who could actually convey important pieces of information, prioritize it, and do it in 30 seconds. So that's something that I learned from the team of producers that I had around me. And I had the same producer for almost 20 years, and who has gone on to win, he won an Emmy, he won an Oscar, an extraordinarily talented producer. And I learned so much from him. And, as a teacher, it's the same thing. It's, a classroom is, my theory of learning and teaching was to get a seminar together. It's a group of students, ideally between 15 and 18, and throw ideas out and let them grapple with it and to see where it goes. And every class is different. So that's also a form of team building, because you're building trust between yourself and your students, but also among your students who are going to respond to each other. So I think in every facet of my professional life, whether it be writing, television, or teaching, having the trust of a community has been essential to whatever success I've had.
Which part did you love the most when you were in front of a screen, with respect to television, the writing aspect of your career, the teaching aspect of it? Or would you consider all three to be equally rewarding in the sense of that where your true skills and your expertise really shine?
That's a great question. It's one I've struggled with. I really found each aspect of my professional career rewarding in its own way. So, there are times when you just have a great class, where students are exchanging ideas and they're passionate and they've done the work and they're knowledgeable. And you walk out of there and you feel great. You're on a cloud. The same is true with doing a TV show where you're interviewing guests, like sort of like what you do. And, at the end of the interview, you're like, wow, that went really well. It went well because I learned a lot, but I think the audience learned a lot as well. And I also, I enjoy writing. I remember when I first started my career, I was an assistant professor at Yale. And I was working so hard. And I was sitting at my desk one night. I always worked late because I had to write lectures for the next day. And I said to myself, if I could choose to do one thing of all the things that I do, what would I most want to do? And I realized at that moment, I said, I'd like to be a writer. And I like writing not because it's more fulfilling, but because it gives me so much more freedom. I can make my own schedule. I can, if I wake up one day and I'm full of energy, I can just work all day and block everything else out. If I wake up someday like I did yesterday and had to have oral surgery, I can take the day off. So that is where I am now. I've retired from teaching, I've retired from television, and I'm just writing books now. And I find it, especially at my advanced age, I find it really fulfilling and rewarding. And it's exactly what I want to be doing right now.
Well, that's wonderful, Stephen. You talk about your storied career at the History Channel, and storied in the sense of, you accomplished so much. You have an illustrious background, and to say that you worked with the same producer for 20 years, that's a blessing. You see that with other programs, but because of the turnover in our industry, being broadcast media, or even from a news writing standpoint, digital media standpoint, there are opportunities for people to work with producers or whomever for a longer period, maybe on special projects, or maybe from the standpoint of a documentary. But how much of that was so critical to have 20 years with the same producer? And I'm sure that by having that longstanding relationship from a relationship building perspective, that attributed to a lot of success as well. And I love the fact that you talk about how much writing means to you, because as people get older, they tend to be more reflective and have that type of the introspective nature of putting your thoughts from mind to paper. And then it takes on a different meaning when you're writing, because it's not just in your mind all the time. It's how you feel in the moment. And once you're writing and you get on a roll, you're feeling that your mind is clear, you tend to put out your best work when, to your point, you can clear your schedule because you're retired and be on your own schedule without any distraction. So it's a two-part question: the importance of having that producer for 20 years at the History Channel, but also now that you get to write more, which I'm sure you love.
Yeah. Well, first of all, to qualify, I should qualify that I had the same producer. I've had other producers at various points on different projects, but this is one producer I have been with for 20 years. So he was not my producer for every project, in part because of what you said, the fragmentation in the industry, the move to among studios and networks to reduce costs by bringing in younger people who are less experienced. So I wish I had this one producer for every project I ever did, but I've had other producers as well who also turned out to be wonderful. I've been really lucky. You talk about teamwork. I've been lucky. I've always been a part of a team that I've respected, and there's always been a lot of mutual respect. And so that's been a really critical part of one of the reasons why I enjoy doing television. It's really difficult. I've never had a situation where I disliked the people I work with. I've always not only liked them as people, but I also respected them for their knowledge and what it is they could add to whatever project we were working on. So in that sense, I feel, I was with one network for more than 20 years, which is really unusual. I started with the History Channel before they even went on the air.
Wow.
I'll tell you a funny story, and this ties in to John, and it gives you an idea why
Yes,
John was such an important person in my life. So the History Channel, I think, went on the air in 1995. And what they were doing is they had to create a whole bunch of product to put on the air when they turned the switch and went on in 95. So they were taking these old documentaries that had been done by CBS and trying to upgrade them update them, I guess is a better way. So one, there was a series of documentaries by Mike Wallace, famous CBS newsman, and they wanted to freshen it up by bringing in younger faces, newer faces. And I was at Yale at the time, and I was not far from New York, and I get a call from the network, and they heard they got my name from somewhere, and then I could talk about like Roosevelt and Truman, and because I do modern American political history, and I said, yeah, I'd be happy to do it. So I took the train down to New York, and I did this for a while. And then once they were on the air, one of their most popular shows was called Movies in Time. It was hosted by Sander Van Oker, a former ABC newsman who was a wonderful, wonderful guy. And I was a talking head. We'd watch a movie, and then he'd interview me about how accurate it was. And I really liked what I was doing. I enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun. So I got the bug. I didn't want to just be a talking head who popped up and said something stupid and disappeared. I wanted to be a host. I wanted to host my own show. So I went to the head of the network and I told her, and she was the person who hired me originally, and I had a great relationship with her. And I'll never forget what she said to me. She said, Steve, there's two types of people on the History Channel. There's historians and there's talent. You're an historian. So I was obviously deflated. And at this point, I'd moved on to Oxford. So when I would come in to do stuff for the History Channel, they would put me up for like a week. So I wouldn't appear jet lagged on camera. And it so happened that John was in town and free 3 nights in a row. So I had dinner with John Kennedy 3 nights in a row. One at twice at a place called Cafe Luxembourg, and another at a place down by where he lived. And I told him the story. And he, of course, did what he always did, made fun of me, teased me. I didn't think he was taking me very seriously. So that was a Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. And I had to go in the office on Thursday to record to practice for recording on Friday. And I go into the office, and there's all this buzzing, people walking around. And the executive producer came up to me and said, you got to sit down for this. You won't believe this. I said, what? He said, John Fitzgerald Kennedy Jr. called our CEO, and he said he will do a exclusive interview on what would have been his father's 80th birthday, but he would do it under one condition: I host the show.
That's awesome.
So we did the interview. It got a lot of attention, and based on that, the network gave me my own show. So that gives you insight into John, and the type of person that he was, that he, without even telling me, like, he didn't want to get credit for it. He just, he wanted to help a friend. And John was always humble and modest, but he had no problem with flexing his muscle to help his friends. And he would make phone calls for people to help him get them jobs. So my whole career at the History Channel really goes back to John and John's personal generosity.
Well, that's an extraordinary story. And I say that because that's relationship building in a team environment at its finest. I mean, it speaks to not just because JFK Jr., who was your lifelong friend, he believed in you. And to your point, he didn't want the credit. He knew that his name carried the weight of being a Kennedy, being the son of our president of the United States, being the nephew of our former Attorney General, RFK, who tragically also was assassinated. That was in 1968, JFK's assassination being 1963. But just for my audience at home who might be younger, not knowing when those points in the 60s that really revolutionized our country from the standpoint of just the mixture of emotions dealing with everything from JFK to RFK to Malcolm X to MLK, and how there was highs and lows in the 60s. But that could be a separate part of our interview, of being that you're an historian, how those deaths of these leaders, the greatest leaders of our time, especially going back 60 plus years, how that really shaped even someone like JFK Jr. being the son, and knowing that he also was somebody who believed in service and being able to help his fellow colleagues or his friends and whomever. So the fact that that conversation led you to your extraordinary career at the History Channel, getting to host your own show, when just a few moments ago you're talking about how you felt deflated because that person didn't believe that you could be a host of your show, only be the historian. So it speaks to how strong your friendship was with JFK. It speaks to the beauty of one person helping another, knowing that one person believes in another person, knowing that that person deserved a shot, that person would be a good steward of the opportunity. You were never that going to be that person who would take that casually. Oh, JFK Jr. recommended me an opportunity because we're friends. This is great. No, you really took it seriously. It speaks to your longevity at the History Channel. It's a testament to how much you valued that friendship with JFK Jr. And you did an amazing job as a host. And when you were able to get that call and knowing that JFK Jr. did that for you, knowing that your dear friend did that to you, I mean, how did that make you feel? May sound like a rhetorical question, but what were your emotions at that moment, knowing that you were going to get a chance because your friend believed in
Yeah. Well, my first emotion was I better not screw this up because John had put his reputation on the line to give me this opportunity. And I remember when we did the interview, we would film at the CBS. This wasn't at CBS. This is at another studio. We filmed the interview with John, and there just happened to be maybe usually when you do a show like this, when you're film taping, you have your producer, you have your producer, you have camera people, sound people, makeup, but that's about it. Well, on this day, there were probably 25 different young, attractive women in the audience who were there to not just to see me or hear the interview, but to meet John. And we had these History Channel mugs. And as we got up and I escorted John out to his car, and I said, someone's going to take his mug. So just as a joke, I switched them. So there's somebody out there who has a big History Channel mug who they think has John F. Kennedy Jr.'s DNA on it. In fact, it's just mine. But I remember doing the show. He helped me. He just put me at ease. It was my first time hosting a show. And I had a hell of a time reading from a teleprompter. But having him there and knowing that he was supporting me, and it made it enjoyable. And he made the experience rewarding for me. So and then when it aired, I think it was the next morning, I got a call from William Morris, an agent at William Morris, saying they wanted to represent me. And I called the History Channel. I said, this is great. You won't believe this. And they were like, no, don't sign anything. Let's have lunch today. So I had lunch, and the head of the network, who I previously told her my plans to be a host, told me that she doesn't know what she's going to do for me. She's going to come up with a show for me. And my agent was saying, no, don't do that. I can get you a better deal. And her name is Abby Raven, absolutely wonderful person. She said to me, Steve, you have to decide whether you trust me. And one of the best decisions I ever made in my life was to trust Abby, who went on to not only be the head of programming, then the head of History Channel, and she was the head of A&E, and then she became the president of A&E Television Networks. And so it was just it's one of those experiences that really changed the trajectory of my life. Up until that moment, I was a traditional historian. Teaching at Oxford, I was going down the traditional academic historian path, and the History Channel opened up a whole another world to me that I had not previously even thought of. And I found it, for me, it was an extension of the classroom. Instead of teaching, whether it's 100 or 200 students in a classroom, you have a viewership of 700, 800, 900,000. In some cases, you're doing a documentary, a couple million. So for me, it was the same thing as teaching, but teaching through using a different technique, in this case, using the camera and to go into people's homes rather than having students who are forced to sit in front of you because they're paying to be there. But yeah, it was a major turning point in my life.
Yes, absolutely. And a pivotal one. And it really, again, I could just hear it in your voice how much that part of your life you hold near and dear to your heart because of JFK Jr. being so instrumental in you getting a position like that. That was very well deserved because you proved to be an exceptional historian, and you saw hosting your show as definitely an opportunity within your grasp that you would excel at, and you knew that, and JFK Jr. knew it too. So I loved how you talk about just you two connecting on that, and that again is a wonderful example of relationship building. When you think about your time at Brown University, I believe that's when you first met John. What were the first impressions you had when you met him? And what was he like as a younger man when you both were in college at the Ivy League Brown University? But as you guys were getting older, talk to me about some of these, whether anecdotally or just what comes to mind, in those early days of knowing him, becoming his friend. Maybe there are examples you can draw upon that are also relationship building oriented. But, as you continued on your friendship, it's really helpful for my audience and me to understand how much of an impact he had on you, but also equally important, how much of an impact you had on him, being that he was a part of the fabled Camelot, right? The Kennedy family. And that information that we probably, as much as these documentaries like the one that CNN recently released, American Prince, the JFK Jr. story, but even all the other documentaries you've been a part of, or people who have interviewed you, and books you've written, and the words of wisdom is what my audience would really appreciate of what he shared with you.
Well, we got off to an awkward start. I went to grad school in 79, Brown in the fall of 1979, and John entered as an undergraduate in the fall of 1979. And it was in his sophomore year, I was a teaching assistant in a class in modern American political history. And the way, as a teaching assistant, you run weekly discussion sections, and you do most of the grading for the students who are in your section. This class was pretty big. There were a couple of teaching assistants, and it was a class in modern American political history. And before the class began, I knew John was on campus, but it never occurred to me that he would take this class. And before the class began, the professor he insisted that his teaching assistants give a lecture, because that's what we're going to do for the rest of our lives if we get a job. So I had never spoken in public before, and I told him I wanted to give a lecture on the 60s. We essentially narrowed it down. I'd give a lecture on the Kennedy administration. So this is all before the class begins. And then the first day of class, I'm in the back of the room when I'm handing out syllabi, and I see this big mop of brown hair coming toward me. I think, no, please don't do this to me. So it's John. So anyhow, I spent about, 5 weeks researching and writing the lecture. And then I spent at least 3 or 4 more weeks memorizing it. Like, I was not going to screw this opportunity up, because the professor who I was a teaching assistant for is the one who I wanted to be my dissertation director. So I had to impress him, and he's a very demanding guy. I was going to give a lecture in front of 100 bright young undergraduates. I had never spoken in public before. And I'm going to be talking about a guy, and his son is going to be sitting in front of me in the classroom, assuming he showed up that day. So I was as nervous as you could possibly imagine. I didn't sleep the whole night before. And you have to realize every day, 3 or 4 times a day, I would practice this lecture. And I had it all written out. So I go, it's 11 a.m. and Manning Chapel was the classroom. And I climb up on the stage. I have the lectern in front of me. And I'm so nervous, I had to put my hands in my pocket because I didn't want students to see how my hands were shaking. And the first line of the lecture was, President Kennedy was a pragmatist who did not impose moral solutions on problems. Right? Pretty straightforward, right? So I get up there, and my teaching career began like this. I just went blank. And, some people, when they are confronted with serious problems, they reach down inside and they find that well of strength. Like, people lift cars and do other things. Well, I'm not one of those people. I hyperventilate. So I'm hyperventilating, and I feel like I'm about to pass out. And I look down at the page in front of me, and it's blurred by this point. It's all blurry. So I had to blurt something out. I had to say something. Otherwise, I was just going to have to run off the stage, and my graduate career be over. So I went, President Kennedy had no moral scruples. Now, I don't believe that now. I didn't believe it then, but that's what came out. So I looked down, and John's right in front of me. I look down, he looks up at me, and fortunately, there was a female student in the back of the class who was far enough away that she couldn't see how nervous I was, and she just laughed, and the whole class erupted in laughter, thinking it was all a big joke. And it broke the ice, and I gave the lecture, and it went fine. And John came up afterwards and shook my hand and said, thanks. I thought it was a good lecture. And then I would see him on campus like in his junior year, but to say hi, not much. And then his senior year, I'm a frustrated baseball player. I played in college, I played semi-pro ball, and I used to work out with the Brown baseball team. So I had access to the varsity weight room, and John was playing rugby, so he had access to the varsity weight room. And we both ended up being there around 3:00 every afternoon. And initially, we just did our own thing. And then I remember he asked me to spot for him. And next thing you know, we're working out together. And he comes up to me in the library one day, and he always called me Stevie. He says, Stevie, there's we need to get some cardio exercise, not just lift weights. And I want to play racquetball. Let's play racquetball. But Brown only had squash courts, and I won't tell you how he described squash courts. But he was very dismissive of the game, put it that way. So we end up joining a gym in Seekonk, Massachusetts, and sometimes once a week, sometimes twice a week, we would hop in his little blue Honda and drive to Seekonk, and we'd work out and play racquetball, these really rigorous, ruthless games of racquetball. And then we would hop in his car and drive back toward campus. And usually the cafeteria was closed by then, so we'd stop and get something to eat. Of course, John never had any money on him. So there's this new fancy restaurant called Wendy's. we would eat at Wendy's all the time. But that was really when I got to know John, when we spent a lot of time together. And what's always struck me then and continuing on is John, the way people reacted to John. And just two quick stories. One time, John was always losing things, So one time we're at the gym and working out. He goes, I can't find my keys. We're looking around. I said, I'll go to the front desk and see if maybe somebody turned them in. So I go to the front desk and I said, my friend John lost his keys. Did anyone turn them in? And they're like, no, but we're right on it. And they get on the microphone like, Mary, Joan, Carol, to the front desk, please. The next thing you know, you got these four well-dressed, attractive women on their hands and knees searching for John's keys. So, and they found them, right? So flash forward like a month later, I lose my keys. I go up to the front desk and say, I lost my keys. Did anyone turn them in? Like, no, what do you want us to do about it? Like, oh, okay, I get it. I'm not John F. Kennedy Jr. So there were stories like that, but that was the time that I really got to know John. And what I learned about him, and this continued for the rest of his life, is that John always said he didn't want to do what other people expected him to do. Like everyone wanted him to go into politics. When you're running for office, and John just put politics aside. He didn't want to talk about it. He didn't want to deal with it. He saw how his cousins had gone into politics. He thought too early when they weren't really ready for it. So he wanted to do other things. So when he graduated, he went to India for a year, and he wrote me these funny letters from India about he spent all day sitting in a tree smoking pot, and about his intestinal issues while he was in India. And so he was hilarious. John was really funny. Then he came back. He went to law school without ever really wanting to be a lawyer. And then he started George Magazine. And the whole time, this issue of who is John Kennedy Jr. He wanted to find out for himself by doing different things who he really was. And one of the layers of tragedy that about his death is that he had just figured out that, after putting politics out of his life for so long, that's what he really wanted to do. He wanted to go into politics. And of course, that was cut short. But throughout his life, John, what was most impressive about John is despite all these pressures that were placed upon him by his family, by the public, he turned out to be a really normal guy. As another mutual friend said, he turned out to be disgustingly normal. And that was John's great achievement, I think, is that despite all the pressure on him, he managed to develop a really down-to-earth, honest personality. He was modest, carefree, a little too carefree sometimes, but he was always fun to be around, had a great sense of humor. And so I learned about John, but I also learned about what it was like, a small sampling of what it was like to be him based on the way other people reacted to him. So we'd be walking down the street. It was funny because women would just stop and stare at him. Men didn't want to get caught staring at him. So they're the ones who would walk into walls, walk into telephone poles, because they're trying to check him out but without letting anybody know. And I've seen many of them walk into telephone poles. But that's what John's life was, and he just came to accept it. Well, I'll tell you one funny story it gives you an idea about John and his instincts. Like John had great political instincts. So this is back in the day when if you wanted to watch a boxing match, you had to go to a bar or something to watch on HBO, and they'd have the big projector set up, right? So we go to South Providence, which is a part of Providence that no Brown student has probably never ventured before. And I'm there with John, and two other friends came along. We walk into this bar, and I knew it was going to be a long night because you looked up on the wall and there was a portrait of Jesus Christ and John's dad right next to it. So I thought, okay, this is going to be interesting. So, and I noticed that everyone looking, John's oblivious. So we're standing there. It's like the bar's over to our right, and they moved all the chairs and stuff out of the way. And we're standing in this like rectangle. And he's standing behind me, and we're watching the fight. And I noticed the crowd parting in front of us. And the guy comes up and he pushes me out of the way. He looked like Danny DeVito. Like, and he looks up at John. His arms fall to his side. And he says, "You're John. You're John." And John was always uncomfortable in those moments. They kind of looked around. And the guy hugged him, said, "I loved your father. I loved your father." And he goes to the bartender, "Free drinks." Of course, John got his drinks for free. I had to pay for mine. But the guy disappears. 10 minutes later, crowd parting again. It's the same guy, and he's dragging along a woman who clearly was just woken up. And he stands in front of John. And he says, "Marilyn, who was his wife, I want you to meet my good friend, John Kennedy." And I'm like, "Wait a second, you just met him 15 minutes ago." And John reaches his hand out and says, "Hi, Marilyn. I've heard so much about you. I'm glad I finally got to meet you." And I'm like, wait. So I let it go. We go out to the car and like, "John, what just happened? What happened in there?" Like, and he said he read the situation brilliantly. The guy was the owner of the bar. He lived above the bar. He had told his family, and his wife in particular, he was friends with my family. So he said, "What harm did I do? I made two people really happy tonight." And I'm like, "Okay, you got it. You're going into politics at some point." So
and that was John's, right? Because, like you said, he had this unassuming type of personality where he knew who he was and who his
yeah,
father was and who his family was, and because of the Kennedy name. But to your point, he had that mystique. I mean, people would be, walking to walls or telephone poles because
yeah,
they're staring
yeah,
at him, wanting to get a glimpse of him. And we've had people throughout history, whether former presidents or professional athletes or even the Pope. I mean, people can look at certain individuals and they have this aura about them.
yeah,
And it is fascinating to me that he had those instincts or those innate abilities to know that I want to make people feel good. I want to make them feel that they're a part of my circle in that moment or a part of the space that I operate in, because I'm no better than he or she. Like, there is a humanizing element to him, even though people looked at his family as, again, I mentioned, like
yeah.
mythical or like fabled in a sense. And I love that description of him because he seems like he handled it so well.
He did.
And maybe even to you, you were even saying like, "John, why'd you do that?" Or what was that about? But then he explains it to you and you're like, "Oh, that makes sense. That's interesting that you would think to do that, given that who you are." But that's who he was. Would you say that and I don't want to use this word, it's not in a negative sense, definitely in a positive sense, because it's almost so innocent that it's refreshing. But even someone like him who came from the most important, if not the most revered American family in a lot of respects, but was there some type of naivete about him, meaning that he knew who he was, but there was some innocence, there was some naivete about him where that's just who he was and he can't be anything else. He's not going to be this stuck up person. He's not going to be snobbish in a way. There are a lot of people who are descendants of famous people, but the offspring, they don't carry that clout, or gravitas, but they want to try to act like it, but they haven't deserved the credit, maybe their parents or grandparents or whomever it might be. But for him, to your point, he wasn't looking to go into politics. He wasn't looking to be in the limelight. He almost felt, to your point, uncomfortable if somebody said, "Oh, you're JFK Jr." So did you find it to be refreshing that there was some innocence, some naivete about his personality?
So John once told me that he was two people, that he was just John Kennedy, a typical, though very privileged member of his generation. But he had a role. He played a role his whole life. And that role was John Fitzgerald Kennedy Jr., the son of a slain president and a cultural icon. And so people were curious why John was interested in acting. He'd been acting his whole life. So John was like Superman, right? He was Clark Kent, but if he needed to be, he'd go into that phone booth and he'd come out as John Fitzgerald Kennedy Jr. So he knew, and he knew what he meant to people. He knew what his family meant to people. And at times it was a burden. But he always said he would never change it for anything because there are lots of benefits to being John F. Kennedy Jr. too. So he took the benefit, he took the downside with the good side. But I don't think he was naive at all. I think he had a very sophisticated understanding of who he was and why people dealt with him the way they did. And he never allowed the views that other people had of him to change the way he viewed himself. He had a very strong self-identity. He knew who he was. So he wasn't corrupted by the praise or by the fawning admiration. In fact, that was the easiest way to lose favor with John, is to, if he thought that you were just kissing up to him or you were treating him differently because of who he was. So, I think I said this in the documentary, that when you think of the Kennedys, you think of public service. You think of, presidents and senators and people who've had an impact on our public life. And I think John's greatest achievement was private. And his greatest achievement was to emerge as a normal, down-to-earth, honest, caring human being, despite the environment in which he grew up. And I think that was his greatest achievement, was a personal one, a private one.
Sure. And I think that, it says a lot about, who he was. And in the documentary, it talked about how he struggled with that public persona and the private citizen he was, with his marriage to Carolyn, and the fact that, in the documentary, it's that struggle because he's used to the limelight and she wasn't. She felt uncomfortable at times. I mean, she wasn't interested, nor did she feel comfortable about the paparazzi being around her. And, that tragic passing, what type of conversations were you having with him leading up to that tragic passing? And where were you when you learned the news? And I know that I also mentioned a gentleman by the name of Keith Stein, who's also interested to come on my podcast. And you said you interviewed Keith in your book. Please feel free to share details about your book. And Keith, I learned about Keith from an article from The Guardian where 4 days before JFK Jr. passed, and we were talking about offline, that he went up to Toronto and he's trying to talk to investors to promote George, his magazine. And I look forward to having that conversation with Keith, but you could certainly shed some light on that relationship.
What happened is John had a horrible last year of his life, especially the last couple of months. Anthony Rodswell, who was John's cousin and also his best friend, was dying of cancer. And John was writing Anthony's eulogy at the time that he died. And Anthony only survived him by a couple of weeks. His marriage was in a really bad place. And for a lot of the reasons that you mentioned, I think that they both miscalculated how the media would respond to him getting married. He really believed that they'd leave him alone, that now he wasn't the most eligible bachelor in America, and he was now a married man who wanted to have a family. And instead, it intensified. And he grew up with it. He was born with it, and he knew how to manage it. And Carolyn did not. And I fault John for this. John could have done more to support her and to help her. Family could have hired someone like a PR person or someone to help manage that, but they didn't. And they threw her to the wolves. And these paparazzi were just horrible to her, just horrible. They treated her and made her life miserable, and in turn made John's life miserable too. So, and no one really knows what would have happened to that marriage had they not died in a plane crash. And someone said to me, a really close friend of his, and I believe this, he said, if anyone tells you they know how that relationship was going to end, is lying, because John and Carolyn didn't know. And then the third part of it was George Magazine was failing. And Hachette, who was a co-owner with John, had let John know that it was clear that they were not going to fund the magazine anymore. They were pulling their support. So John, in those final months of his life, is going around, cup in hand, asking for people to take ownership of the magazine. And he went to Toronto to meet with Keith Stein and a group of businessmen in Toronto. And I remember I had a great conversation with Keith. You'll love him. He's a great interview. And, he was one of the last people to see John alive. And John flew up with an instructor. He had a cast. He still had the cast on his leg.
Right.
And Keith said something to me that I've heard from other people. He said that John, he didn't sound the way he expected him to. And I think people, because John's a Kennedy, they think John's going to sound like his father. You know, they expect this Boston accent, this crisp Boston accent. John grew up his whole life in New York. You know, there was no accent. So I think Keith, the sense I got was that he was a little underwhelmed by John, but John was that way because he was so casual and easygoing, and people had these expectations of who he was going to be. And they ended up not investing, and that was just a few days before John died. And you know, I was dealing with John a lot, talking to John quite a bit in that last month, and it had, and you know, when I did my book, that's when I learned how difficult the last months of his life were. I didn't know it. I was talking to him all the time. He was helping me through a crisis. I developed a tremors in my hand, and I was having all these muscle spasms. And you know, it's in the early days of the internet. So I got online and did what we all do. I self-diagnosed, and I thought of the worst thing I could possibly have, which was Parkinson's. And I finally went to a neurologist. I saw a neurologist the week before John died. And he did an exam and he said, you don't have Parkinson's, but you could be in the early stages of ALS, which is not a diagnosis you want to get. And I was going to have a series of tests beginning on Tuesday. And that night, I called a mutual friend of ours and said, listen, this is what's going on. Don't tell anybody. I don't want anyone else to know until I get a diagnosis. So, of course, he hangs up the phone and calls John. So I spent that night, Friday night. This is the Friday night before John dies now. I'm walking around Norman, Oklahoma, just trying to gather my thoughts. I come home and there's 2 messages on my answering machine from John. And he's like, Stevie, it's a Friday night at 9:30. You never go out. I know you're home. Pick up the phone. But I didn't feel like talking, so I didn't pick it up. So Saturday morning, the phone rings at like 8 a.m. I answer it, and it's John. And you know, I told him what happened, and I'll never forget what he said to me. He said, "Stevie, for better or worse, my family is well connected in New York medical circles, and whatever you need, whatever doctor you need to see." And I'll never forget. He said, "I'll take care of you," and he repeated. He said, "I'll take care of you," and that was the Saturday exactly. And this following Saturday, roughly the same time, I woke up and found out that his plane was missing. But he called me again on Sunday just to chat. You know, he wanted, Daniel Patrick Moynihan had resigned from the Senate, and there was a big debate over who's going to run for the Senate seat. And John's name was there, and Hillary was talking about running. And John, he really admired Bill Clinton in particular. I don't think he knew Hillary as well, but he liked Hillary and nothing against her. But he was like, you know, Stevie, he said, Stevie, somebody should write an article about this carpetbagger, you know, Hillary, coming in to run for a Senate seat in New York. And I said, John, you know, a person whose last name is Kennedy shouldn't be saying that. That's what his uncle did. His uncle Bobby moved to New York. He lived in a hotel room in order to run for the Senate in 1965. But anyhow, then I spoke to him again on Tuesday when I found out that there was nothing really wrong with me, nothing seriously wrong with me. And the last conversation we talked about playing racquetball that following Monday. I was going to come to New York, and he was getting his cast off on Friday. And we're joking about what we're going to look like on the court with him not being able to walk, and me, my shaky hand. And that was the last conversation I had with him.
Yeah. I'm so sorry, even many years later. You know, it's been 26 years since hard to believe since he passed. And, you know, I really appreciate you sharing such, you know, intimate details about your last conversations with him, because there are a lot of questions that will forever be unanswered. I mean, well, before I say that, I mean, for him to say that he'll take care of you, that he would take care of you, I mean, those words I'm sure will be so indelible in your mind for the rest of your life, that he didn't realize that his days were numbered on this earth, and that he was thinking that maybe your life could potentially be shortened depending on a Parkinson's diagnosis or an ALS diagnosis, God forbid. Thank God you are here today. We wish that he was here today, and, you know, God makes plans for every individual. And, you know, even for us as humans, it's just out of the realm of our capacity as humans to know why certain things happen to some people, and it happened to him. And, you know, there just questions are coming into my mind just for you, if you have any thoughts about it. You know, when I think about his plane crash, was it avoidable? I mean, was he known to be a risk taker like some of his other or several of his other family members that you hear about? I had an English teacher in high school. She would be considered to be an historian, I guess you would say. I mean, she was friends with my history teacher, who I mentioned also went to Yale, Temple Law School. I was telling you about him offline, Bob Bradshaw, who would find this topic to be very fascinating. But she had said to me in high school, she said, it's not that the Kennedys were unlucky, meaning that a lot of them had passed, tragically with, for different reasons. It's just that they were considered to be at times risk takers. So would that be an accurate depiction? I mean, was he considered to be a risk taker, or was he wrong place, wrong time, not just thinking it through, that if he didn't have a certain number, maybe of flight hours in that particular situation, that maybe he should have had a more experienced flight instructor with him? But I don't want to speculate, because you were one of his dear friends. Great
no,
friends.
you're absolutely. Listen, I make this clear in my book. John bears sole responsibility for that accident and for the death of his wife and her sister. People talk about the Kennedy curse. There is no Kennedy curse. The Kennedy curse is that they're reckless. They're risk takers. JFK ignored the pleas of the Secret Service and insisted on going through Dallas in an open limousine. RFK would be in an open car with, hundreds and hundreds of people reaching out to try to touch him. And John, listen, I drove in a car with John. I wouldn't get into a plane with John. He never should have taken off that night. A lot of other pilots that night, even those who were more experienced than John, with the fog rolled in, they would land somewhere inland and then wait until the morning and take off. But John, he wasn't trained in instruments. He was just, people say when there's a plane crash, it's not one thing, it's a series of mistakes that you make. And John made a whole series of mistakes that night. And it's still a tragedy, but it's one for which he has to take personal responsibility. And
his wife and his sister-in-law, who were in the plane with him, how much, I would imagine, since, the answer you just gave me probably answers my next question, how much did his wife's and his sister-in-law's family blame him for that accident?
100%. And I'm sure there was some massive financial settlement, but that was all secret. I have no idea, but I'm sure there was. I mean, there's no two ways around it. John was negligent, and that's a tragedy. It's a tragedy.
Sure, and because he was just entering the political scene or had aspirations, you had mentioned that when he was a younger man, you probably wouldn't have thought about politics. He really wanted to cast that idea aside. But then, really ironically, toward the end of his life, you saw that change in mindset that, oh, maybe this is the right path for me. If he had not passed away, would you have seen him as, maybe it's not Senator John Kerry running in 2004, it's not Senator Barack Obama running in 2008? I mean, do you think that he was on the trajectory where probably within the next election or two election cycles, that we would have seen a President JFK Jr., or maybe would have become a U.S. Senator first? I mean, I know it's pure speculation because his life was cut short, but being that you were one of his closest friends, do you think that being that he was interested toward the end going into politics, that he would have been somebody, okay, my father was president, I'd like to be president?
I think John did have political aspirations near the end of his life. I think if all had gone well, I think what he would have liked to have done is run for governor of New York. John had heard stories about how bored his father was in the House and in the Senate. John thought of himself as an executive, as someone who would make decisions. So he was never going to run for the Senate. And then, who knows? I mean, I think John probably would have won if he'd run for governor against George Pataki. I think he would have won. But then, it becomes uncertain after that. The way the calendar worked out, if he had been a governor of New York and a successful governor, it would have set him up to run for president in 2008. But there was another really talented politician in the race in 2008 named Barack Obama, who John would have adored, I'm sure. And, as I was John's friend, and I think highly of him, and I think he had a lot of talent, a lot of skill. But as a political historian, I know that you can't predict these things, and life is full of twists and turns. And I think John would have had challenges as a candidate. And the biggest challenge, when you're talking to Keith about this, is that John wasn't his father. And I think a lot of this, John's greatest asset, which is that he was John F. Kennedy Jr., would be his greatest liability, because people would think that John F. Kennedy Jr. would remind them in some way of his father. And he just did not in any way. Didn't have any of his mannerisms. He didn't have his father's sharp intellect. So, so I don't know how things would have turned out. I just don't know.
It's interesting because would you say he was more like his mother, Jackie Kennedy, where his sister ended up becoming U.S. ambassador a couple of times,
Yeah.
Caroline Kennedy? It almost as if when she saw her brother pass, maybe she felt that political will to be a part of administrations and maybe do things at the highest public service level that was available at the time, being that she held the ambassadorship twice on two
Yeah.
separate occasions. So, how much you know about?
I don't know enough about Caroline to speculate what her intentions were, her ambitions. I don't know very much about her, and I'm reluctant to speculate.
Sure. And after he passed away, what was that grieving process like for you? I mean, how did that change the course of history, even in your career, when you knew that he wasn't going to be somebody in your corner at any moment if you wanted to call him up and say, "Hey, John, I'm going through this problem or I have this obstacle. Would love to get your advice. Would love to speak with you about this." And or missing out on the last 26 years of him calling you up and saying, Stevie, I have this question I'd like to ask you. I mean, I'm really going through this and I want to get your opinions, want to get your thoughts on this. I mean, do you feel like because you've missed out on that types of conversations the last 26 years, I don't want to use the word hindered because you're your own person, you're your own successful person. Yes, he was pivotal in helping you get that position at the History Channel, but you're Steve Gillon, the successful historian,
Yeah.
Ivy League trained, successful professor, successful book author, successful host, somebody who is very much respected and someone who is in the highest of his professions in the top 1% of historians. So I would love to just hear your thoughts because only you can answer this question. How much do you feel you lost? Yes, anybody who's ever been friends with him, anybody who's ever been family members of his, been in the circles, it's an automatic loss. But just from the standpoint of not being able to hear his thoughts
Yeah.
about things, what we went through in 9/11. He wasn't alive during 9/11. He wasn't alive during Hurricane Katrina, the Great Recession. He didn't see the Trump administration take form. He didn't see COVID-19. He didn't see the Make America Great Again movement that we're dealing with now. And then knowing that every other Kennedy besides RFK Jr. is opposed to what the Trump administration is doing. And you're an historian, would love to get your thoughts on how would he have envisioned all of these changes and how disappointed, like his other family members, to know that his first cousin, his father's brother's son, his first cousin is somebody who doesn't believe in vaccines, who is a conspiracy theorist, is an anti-vaxxer, but somebody who joined an administration probably to have a significant title, but knowing that he changed his stripes from a Democrat to an independent. Him running affected Kamala Harris's, Vice President Kamala Harris's chances to perhaps to become president, not thinking that, hey, I could help a fellow Democrat. I'm going to join the other side, probably to get a high position, but knowing that he is not running the Department of Health and Human Services in a way that the rest of the country would hope, I mean, the vast majority, I would say, who would hope that he would run it, but also the condemnation from his fellow Kennedy members who have pretty much ostracized him from the family because he's taking very strong, unpopular, unscientific, and anti-democratic views on healthcare.
Yeah. Just two things I would pick up on. One is John's death was a great personal loss to me and to many other people. And John did help me a lot early in my career, but when I played a very specific role in John's life, we talked about history, we talked about politics, we talked about his father's presidency, and I always played that. I was always in that role as being the professor. So When John died, the week between the time the plane crashed and we had the memorial service that following Friday, during that week, a bunch of us would get together. You'd get a message before email. You get a message on your phone saying, "We're meeting tonight at so and so apartment on the Upper West Side." And I remember the first night, I think it was the Monday night or Tuesday night, I was so reluctant to go because I didn't think anybody would know who I was. Because when I was with John, it was always just the two of us. And I remember going there and walking around the block and thinking, "Oh no, it's going to be embarrassing. No one's going to know who I am. Security's going to throw me out." So I work up the guts. I get up and I knock on the door, and this one of his friends opens it up, and I said, "Hi, I'm Steve Gillon," and he does this with his hand like a racquetball, and he says, "The professor," and then he turns to everyone. And he says, "The professor is here." So that was the role that I played in John's life. I didn't, we didn't travel together. We didn't go on vacations together. I didn't spend time in Hyannisport. We talked about history and politics, and that's the role that I had in his life. And it left his death, I don't know, have had a big impact on my professional life, but it certainly left a gaping hole in my personal life. And John was a great person to get advice from. He had been in therapy for so long and was so good at analyzing motivations and stuff that he would just, if you could talk to him about something you're thinking about and going through, and he would just be able to provide you with a real sort of bright light to help you identify the problem and what you should do. As far as his what's taking place now in our politics, Donald Trump is the antithesis of John Jr. John was born famous. Trump spent his whole life trying to become famous. John cared about people. He cared about civil rights. If there's one issue that he was most passionate about, it was civil rights. He was a Democrat, but not so much in his uncle's image. John had a conservative streak to him. One of the articles he asked me to write for George Magazine was about unintended consequences, which is a popular conservative notion about legislation having intent other than what it was supposed to have. But he was still in the process of figuring all that out. But he would be, I think John would. I remember when Trump would tell people that he was friends with John. He was never really friends with John. He wanted to be friends with John. He wanted to have his picture taken with John. But Trump was like not someone who John. To be honest with you, he never mentioned his name to me in all the years we were friends. So I don't think he thought very highly of him. And now all these QAnon people are making it out like John and Trump are best friends, and John was going to come back from the dead to be Trump's running mate. I mean, it's just gotten to the point of just absurdity. And as far as his cousin, Jackie, when President Kennedy was assassinated, one of the reasons why she left Washington was to get John and Caroline away from Bobby's kids, because she just thought they were wild.
Interesting.
And she tried to limit their interaction with them. That changed as they got older, but Bobby was always kind of an outcast. And I don't think he and John had much of I don't know this for sure, but I don't think they had much of a relationship at all.
Yeah, that's very interesting that you would provide that insight. And although that you probably, as much as you knew John very well and knew a lot about his family and just the history, but it probably, even to your knowledge, perhaps there were things that you may have not been or might have not been privy to that explains why they didn't have so much of a relationship. But the fact that you shared that she thought, Bobby's kids or RFK's kids, one being RFK Jr., were not typically or showed probably certain personality traits.
But they'd be a bad influence on him.
Sure. And you can see just RFK Jr. in the limelight. If you had RFK Jr. as he is today, and you had JFK Jr. all these years later, knowing what we or someone like you, knowing what you knew about him his whole life, and if he was an older man, 26 years later, I would think that because he's the son of our 35th president, he would feel a responsibility that his voice of all Kennedys would have to rival his first cousin, being that RFK Jr. has held the most important position. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, you're the historian. I think RFK Jr. has held the highest position in government since his father and uncle, correct? I mean,
since Teddy.
What other Kennedys have held a cabinet position since, if you consider, well,
Yeah.
Attorney General of the United States, his father, but what
Right.
other, and I'm not counting Ted Kennedy, who was a U.S. senator, but in terms of
Right.
a presidential administration in the White House,
Yeah.
him being having a cabinet position, that he's the highest government official as a Kennedy since the 60s.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Like you, as you pointed out earlier, Caroline was an ambassador, but being that's not a part of the cabinet. Yeah, he is the highest ranking executive branch Kennedy since his father.
And I would imagine that if RFK Jr. can hold a title such as this one as Secretary of Health and Human Services, I would imagine that JFK Jr., being who he was and how very much he was going that political route, I believe that he definitely, if not becoming one of our future presidents, now to present day, but at least holding a cabinet position. But in the remaining time we have left, I would love to know, who is Steve Gillon beyond just the historian? You talk about being a lifelong Philadelphia Phillies fan. Obviously, you're somebody who I wanted to have on my podcast because when I saw you get interviewed for the JFK documentary on CNN, and looking at all the guests I've had, and they started out in sports media and business, and now it's extended it into the political realm. I definitely felt that you would have a fascinating story to tell. And I know that when anytime people mention about JFK Jr., that could overshadow perhaps some people's accomplishments. But that's why I had mentioned earlier that you are your own person and that you have accomplished so much beyond just being a dear friend to JFK Jr. So I would love, in the remaining time that we have, that you talk about the books you've written and talk about your life's journey, and the fact that you wanted to teach at Oxford, and that to me is amazing. So feel free to share any other thoughts you have.
I guess the one thing that's kind of unique about my life is I started out, I was a lousy student in high school. I ranked in the bottom, I think the bottom quarter of my high school graduating class. I was accepted at a place called Widener University on probation. And it was while I was in college that I was inspired by this great history professor. I took a class in medieval history. And I didn't even know what medieval history was. I thought medieval history was everything before the New Deal. But I really thought I was going to be a professional baseball player. And I used to sit in the back of the room with a baseball. I made the varsity as a freshman. I was a pitcher. And I would sit in the back of the room and work on my grips, slider, curveball. And then one day, the professor who normally lectured, it was a small class, maybe 15, 18 students, he opened it up to discussion. And I had actually done the reading. And I remember sitting there and listening to my peers talk. And I was like, why can't I do that? Like, why can't I talk like that? Why I read this material? Why can't I think about it the way they did? And I just came to this realization that, that I was never going to be a professional baseball player. I'm 5'8". I had a 70-mile-an-hour fastball, and that's with hurricane force winds at my back. So I made this decision. I got out of the classroom at the class when the class was over, and I walked down to the gym and I turned in my baseball uniform and I went to the library, I think for the first time. And what I discovered is I had this capacity for learning that I never knew existed. And that's another one of these turning points in my life. I did really well and got accepted to Brown for grad school. And when I graduated from Brown, I got a job at Yale where I spent 10 years, and then Oxford. So for me, one of the reasons I became a teacher is because a teacher changed my life. And they did it by their example. They did it and it was the community of peers in that classroom that inspired me. So if there's a turning point in my life, that's really it. I mean, the other stuff about the History Channel, that's all was all wonderful, but all built on the back of a successful academic career. And that began that day that I came to the realization that if I was going to have any success in life, it was going to be because of my unused brain and not my tired right arm.
Yes, and I love the fact that it's amazing in life how you looked at baseball as an outlet, and then you realize that, okay, I was able to play semi-professional ball, but you realize that, okay, there's more to life than sports, and I have this gift of mentoring and teaching, which then led you down the path of your writings and publishing books and being a part of incredible documentaries. And then again, back to our earlier conversation of that pivotal moment, being able to host your own show on the History Channel, but then really many years later, and as you are now, as you said, retired, you could still have the opportunities to express yourself through your writings and through any type of ways to communicate your thoughts about life and what matters to you. And being that you were a part of the CNN documentary, I know that you were saying when we first connected offline that it would be very hard for you to watch the documentary, which is understandable. But if at some point you do watch the documentary, it'd be fascinating to know if there's anything new that you would have learned about your dear friend, your late dear friend, JFK Jr., or is it something that by watching a documentary, you're like, oh, I know that. I know that. That's,
Yeah.
it's just, just being reemphasized.
Yeah, I haven't watched it. So I doubt, I mean, I know all the people, most of the people who were in it. And, we've all told our stories over the past 26 years. So I doubt if there's anything new. So I think we know who John was now. And I always felt, when you're friends with John, the top priority is protect his privacy, and I think the people who he allowed them in because he knew he could trust them and they wouldn't talk about it. And the big struggle I had when I decided to write the book was, am I violating that trust? Even though he was dead for 16, 17 years, maybe longer than that when I decided to write the book. And a mutual friend, a wonderful friend, Rosemary Terenzio, who was John's executive assistant, and I had dinner one night, and she said to me, if John knew he was going to be dead at the age of 38, he would want to be remembered, and he'd want someone to write a book about them, and he'd want you to be the one to write it. And for me, that's what, so all these things that I participate in are all designed, not because I have any desire to do TV anymore or do interviews anymore, which I don't, but I don't want John to be remembered as the hunk flunks or the sexiest man alive. There was a lot of substance to John. And part of what I try to contribute to these conversations is, the John I got to know and the qualities I saw in him and why I thought he was such a remarkable human being. And 20 years from now, 30 years from now, if anyone wants to know who John Kennedy Jr. was, I don't want them going to People magazine or the National Enquirer. I want there to be, sources there that produced by the people who knew him, who can shed insight on his life.
Well, that's very well stated. And what an amazing compliment that his former executive assistant would say, that if he knew that he passed away at the young age of 38, that he would want you to write a book about him, that he would want you to write his biography. And that just speaks to the relationship that you had and the respect that you had amongst not just his executive assistant, but anyone in the Kennedy family who you would have crossed paths with or gotten to know besides JFK Jr. And maybe as you've gotten older, you've been able to put his death in more context, although, a lot of questions remain unanswered, and what his thought process was at that time of the plane crashing. And you had only spoken with him a few days before he passed. So I really appreciate you sharing all this insight with my audience and me. We've chuckled at some of the stories that you've talked about, even going back to your Brown days or going to Wendy's. And real quick, what conversations did you have when you would eat at Wendy's? Would it be just like the everyday, conversation about class?
Nothing profound. If he beat me in racquetball, he'd be teasing me, telling me I'm fat and old. If I beat him, we talk about something else. We talked about politics a lot. We talked about history.
Yeah.
If there's a new book out about his father, we would talk about it. But I don't remember any specific conversation.
And he never really talked about his family around you because he was such a young child. I mean, only 3 years old
It was his third birthday when his father was buried.
Right, third birthday. That is correct. Did he ever share with you that he felt like he missed out on knowing who his father was, or did he not really talk about it?
Well, the assassination was off limits. We never had a conversation about the assassination. He told me one time, that like he had a hard time separating his own memories from the pictures that he's seen his whole life about his father. But the one story he did remember, the famous picture of him under his father's desk.
Right, the Resolute desk.
He told me that the reason why he was under his father's desk is that his mom would not allow him to chew gum in the White House, but his father would always give him gum. So they
Uh,
go to the Oval Office. His father would give him a stick of gum, and then John would go hide under the desk and chew it, so his mom wouldn't find him. That's one. That's one of the stories he told me that always stuck with me.
sure. Well, thank you so much, Steve. I really appreciate the time. I really do. And the fact that how you went from a student who you felt academically was at the bottom, and then you turn into one of the greatest American historians. I mean,
For the
truly,
metaphor, I appreciate it.
yeah, especially someone who devoted his life to covering his dear friend, his late dear friend, and his family's lives, but also the great work that you did with the History Channel, being a professor at the University of Oklahoma, being a professor at Oxford, being a Brown University graduate, being someone who really cares deeply about the direction that our country goes. Because although a historian can't predict the future, because you're a historian by profession, history, as we know, tends to repeat itself. So you probably are a better predictor of where things are going. And I do pray for our country. I do continue to pray for the Kennedy family because they've gone through a lot of tragic losses in their respective lives, and the extraordinary, amazing accomplishments that the family as a whole achieved. I mean, thank God for the Kennedy family, because I mean they definitely shaped the course of our American history for the better. Being decisive in whether it was the Cuban Missile Crisis, whether it's plans for men to go on the moon, and that was achieved. And thankfully, President Lyndon Johnson was able to achieve a lot of what President Kennedy had aspired to do in the 60s. And I'm so glad that you were a dear friend to JFK Jr. And I know that he's looking down on you from heaven and probably really proud of who you've become. And it should give you great comfort knowing that you did everything you could to impact his life. And I'm sure in the time that he was on this planet, he knew that he did everything he could to impact your life. So it's a special bond that you both will always have. And although that he's no longer here, you could take great comfort knowing that you did so much for him and you impacted his life as much as he's impacted yours.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. I've enjoyed our conversation, Garrett. It's been great talking with you.
It's been wonderful talking to you. I look forward to staying in touch and having many more conversations. Thank you so much again, my 82nd guest on the WaveCapital's guest speaker series on relationship building in a team environment, Steve Gillon. Thank you so much. And I look forward to talking to you again soon. And I'll let you know when our interview airs on my podcast, the WaveCapital's guest speaker series on relationship building and team environment. Take care. And I hope you have a blessed rest of the week.
Thank you. Great talk with you. Bye-bye.
Great talking to you as well. Take care.